My name is Rebecca Hall, and for 34 years, I believe my parents love me the way parents are supposed to love their children, unconditionally, fiercely, without keeping score. I believe that even when the evidence in front of me quietly suggested otherwise, even when I was the one who stayed home to help my father recover from his hip surgery while my sister vacationed in Cabo, even when I was the one who drove 2 hours every Sunday to have dinner with my mother while my sister called in from wherever her latest adventure had taken her. I told myself that love doesn't have to look the same for every child, that some of us show up in quiet ways and some of us shine in loud ones, and that my parents' hearts were big enough to hold both kinds of daughters equally. I was wrong. It took the worst week of my life to show me exactly how wrong I was. My husband's name was Daniel. We met in our second year of nursing school. I was training to become a labor and delivery nurse, and he was training to become a paramedic, and we bonded over stale vending machine coffee and the particular exhaustion that only comes from 12-hour clinical rotations. Daniel had a laugh that filled up a room, the kind of laugh that made strangers in restaurants turn around and smile without knowing why. He proposed to me on a Tuesday in the parking lot of the hospital where we both worked because he said he didn't want to wait for some perfect, curated moment. He wanted me to know the second the thought became unbearable to hold in. We got married 8 years ago in my parents' backyard, under a maple tree that my father had planted the year I was born. My mother cried through the whole ceremony. My sister, Amanda, was my maid of honor, and she gave a toast that had the whole reception laughing and wiping their eyes. For a long time, I thought we were a family that worked. Daniel started getting headaches in the spring. Nothing dramatic at first, just something he'd mention after a long shift, something he'd blame on dehydration or stress or the fluorescent lighting at the station. But the headaches got worse, and then came the dizziness, and then one morning he collapsed in our kitchen while pouring coffee, and I drove him to the emergency room with my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the steering wheel straight. The scan showed a mass. The doctors used careful, clinical language, the kind of language I recognize from my own training. Language designed to prepare you slowly for something that cannot actually be prepared for. Glioblastoma. Aggressive. They gave us a timeline, and then they gave us treatment options, and then they gave us a surgeon who specialized in exactly this kind of tumor and who had, according to every source I could find, one of the best outcome records in the entire region. The surgery was our chance. Not a guarantee. Nothing in oncology is ever a guarantee, but a real fighting chance, the kind of chance you hold onto with both hands because the alternative is unthinkable. The problem was money. Our insurance covered a portion, but the specialist Daniel needed was out of network, and the gap between what insurance would pay and what the surgery would cost was a number so large it made my stomach drop every time I looked at it. We had some savings. Daniel's parents, both retired and living on fixed incomes, gave us what they could, which wasn't much, but which they gave without hesitation, without a single second of debate, because that is what you do when your child's life is on the line. I went to my own parents next. I sat at their kitchen table, the same table I'd done my homework on as a child, and I explained the situation as clearly and calmly as I could. Because I am a nurse and calm clinical explanation is the language I default to when I am terrified. I told them the number. I told them the timeline. We needed the funds within 3 weeks, or we would lose our surgical date, and the next available slot with a surgeon of that caliber was 4 months out, for months that the oncologist had been very clear, in his careful clinical way, that Daniel did not have to spare. I watched my father's face as I spoke, and I watched my mother's hands twist together in her lap, and I told myself their silence was shock, was them processing, was the kind of pause that comes before people rally. "We'll figure something out," my mother said finally, and I let myself believe that meant help was coming. I found out 3 days later, from an offhand comment my aunt made at a family barbecue, that my parents had money. Not endless money, but more than enough to have made a real difference. Money that had been sitting in a savings account for years, earmarked, as it turned out, for something else entirely. Amanda's honeymoon. My sister had got married 5 months earlier, a lavish destination wedding in Santorini that my parents had helped fund generously, and the honeymoon, a 3-week trip through Greece, and Italy that Amanda had been planning and posting about on social media for months, was set to happen the same week Daniel needed his surgery money. My parents had committed to covering a significant portion of that honeymoon as a wedding gift, a promise made before Daniel ever got sick. And when I finally sat my mother down and asked her directly, point blank, whether the honeymoon money could instead go towards saving my husband's life, she looked at me with an expression I will never forget. Not cruelty exactly, but a kind of pained, apologetic firmness, the expression of someone who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for you to stop asking so she doesn't have to feel bad about it anymore. We already promised Amanda, she said. We can't go back on our word now. It would devastate her. You understand, don't you? A promise is a promise. I remember staring at her, waiting for the rest of the sentence, waiting for her to say, but of course Daniel matters more. Of course we'll find a way to do both. Of course your husband's life outweighs a vacation. That sentence never came. My father, sitting beside her, nodded along, adding only that surely the hospital had payment plans, that surely we could find another way, that surely this wasn't as urgent as I was making it sound. He used the word surely 4 times in that conversation. I counted, because counting was easier than feeling. I want to be fair, even now, even after everything. I want to say that maybe they genuinely didn't understand the timeline, that maybe in their minds 3 weeks felt like an abstraction rather than a countdown. But I had shown them the paperwork. I had shown them the letter from the surgical office. I had used the words, if we miss this window, he may not get another one. There was no version of that conversation where the stakes weren't clear. They chose Amanda's honeymoon over Daniel's surgery with full knowledge of what that choice meant, and then they asked me to understand. I did not have the money on my own. Daniel and I scrambled. We took out a second loan against terms that made my chest tight every time I thought about the interest. We sold his motorcycle, the one he'd had since college and loved with an almost embarrassing devotion. We sold my grandmother's ring, the one piece of jewelry I owned that had ever meant anything to me. We got most of the way there. Not all the way. 3 weeks became 4, became 5, because the financing fell through twice and had to be restructured. And by the time we finally scraped together enough to schedule the surgery, the surgeon's calendar had shifted, and more importantly, so had Daniel. The tumor doesn't wait for financing paperwork. That's the cruelest, most clinical fact of the whole ordeal. The fact I understood professionally and still could not accept personally. By the time we had the money, Daniel's decline had accelerated past the point where the original surgical plan was even viable. The window my parents had been told about, the window I had begged them to help us meet, had closed, not because Daniel's body gave up, but because we simply ran out of time waiting for money that could have come 3 weeks earlier if 2 people I trusted more than anyone in the world had simply kept their promise to their son-in-law instead of their promise to a honeymoon. Amanda went to Greece. I have seen the photographs. I couldn't stop myself from looking in the raw, masochistic way you sometimes can't stop yourself from touching a bruise. Santorini sunsets, handmade pasta in Florence, a gondola in Venice, my sister laughing with her head thrown back, her new husband's arm around her shoulders. She posted every single day. My mother commented on nearly every photo with heart emojis and the word beautiful. I sat beside Daniel's hospital bed during those same 3 weeks, watching him grow quieter, watching the parts of him that made him him. The jokes, the restless energy, the way he used to hum while he made coffee, recede a little more each day, like a tide pulling back from a shore it would never fully return to. Daniel died on a Thursday morning in early autumn, 11 days after his sister-in-law posted a photo captioned, "Best 3 weeks of my life." He died holding my hand, in a room that smelled like antiseptic and the sad, wilting flowers someone had brought too early. He was 36 years old. In his final lucid days, he told me he wasn't afraid, that he'd had a good life, that the only thing he regretted was not getting more time with me. He never once, not a single time, expressed anger at my parents. That was Daniel. Even dying, he found room for grace that I have not, in the time since, been able to locate in myself. The funeral was smaller than it should have been for a man so widely loved, because grief during a specific season pulls people in strange directions, and because I didn't have the strength to plan anything elaborate. My parents came. They cried. Real tears, I believe, because I don't think either of them are monsters in the cartoonish sense. I think they are simply people who made an unforgivable choice and then had to live with the consequences of it alongside me. Amanda came too, tan from her honeymoon, and hugged me at the reception and told me she was so sorry, and I remember standing there in my black dress accepting her embrace and feeling absolutely nothing at all. A kind of numbness, so complete it frightened me more than any grief could have. It was 3 weeks after the funeral. 3 weeks. That number again. That number that will haunt every calendar I own for the rest of my life. When my mother called and asked if she could come over to talk about next steps. I should have known. I think some part of me did know, some cynical, hardened part of me that had grown in the compost of the previous 2 months. But I let her in anyway, because some other part of me, some smaller and more stubborn part, still wanted to believe she was coming to check on me, to bring soup, to sit with me in the silence the way mothers are supposed to. She sat at my kitchen table, a different table now, Daniel's and mine, in the house we'd bought together. And she folded her hands in that same twisting way she had all those months earlier, and she told me that she and my father had been having some financial difficulties. The honeymoon trip, it turned out, plus a home renovation they'd started before Amanda's wedding, plus some bad investment my father had made without telling anyone, had left them in a hole considerably deeper than either of them had let on. She said the words "we were hoping," and then she said the words "Daniel's life insurance," and I sat there and watched her mouth move, and I genuinely, for one disorienting moment, could not process that these words were being said to me in this order, in this house, by this person. She asked if I could help them out, her phrase, delivered with the same soft, apologetic firmness she'd used to explain the honeymoon money. With a loan, she called it, though the way she described the repayment plan made it clear she meant a gift, made it clear she expected me to hand over a portion of the money my husband's death had left me. Money that existed only because he was no longer alive to spend it himself, so that they could cover the debts incurred, in significant part, by the very trip that had cost me the time I needed to save him. I want to tell you, I found some devastating, movie-worthy line in that moment, some perfect sentence that put her in her place and restored some cosmic balance to the universe. I didn't. What I actually did was laugh, a short, ugly, disbelieving laugh that surprised even me. And then I asked her very quietly whether she understood what she was asking, whether she remembered the conversation we'd had at her kitchen table 5 months earlier, whether it had occurred to her even once in the drafting of this request that the money she wanted was only in my possession because the money she'd refused to give me when it mattered was spent on plane tickets instead. She said, and I will remember this sentence until the day I die, "That's not fair, Rebecca. We didn't know things would turn out this way." As though Daniel's death had been an unforeseeable twist of fate rather than the direct, documented, timeline-confirmed consequence of a choice they made with full information and total composure. As though I hadn't handed my mother the surgical paperwork myself. As though grief had softened the facts into something more comfortable, something she could live inside without feeling the full weight of what she'd done. I told her no. I told her, as steadily as I could manage, that I would not be giving them any portion of my husband's life insurance. Not now. Not ever. And that I needed her to leave my house. She cried. She called my father from her car in my driveway, and I could hear her voice through the window, pitched high with what I can only describe as genuine, wounded confusion, as though I were the one behaving unreasonably. My father called me that evening and tried a different approach, anger this time, accusing me of being cold, of holding a grudge, of letting money come between family. He used the word family as though it hadn't been the thing they'd already broken. Amanda, when she heard about it, because of course she heard about it within the hour, sent me a long text message that managed, in the way only her messages ever could, to make the entire situation somehow about her. She wrote that she felt caught in the middle, that she hadn't asked our parents to fund her honeymoon, that she was hurt I seemed to be blaming her for a decision that wasn't hers to make. I did not respond. There was nothing left in me to give to that conversation, and some enormous, exhausted part of me recognized that whatever this family had once been, it had ended the day my parents chose a countdown to Santorini over a countdown to surgery. It has been 10 months now. I have not spoken to my mother since that afternoon at my kitchen table. I have spoken to my father exactly once, briefly, when he called to tell me my grandmother had passed away, and even then the conversation lasted less than 2 minutes and contained no mention of anything that had happened. Amanda has texted a handful of times, cautious, testing messages that I have mostly left unanswered, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely do not know yet what role I want her to occupy in whatever version of my life comes next. I used a portion of the life insurance money to pay off the debts Daniel and I had accumulated trying, too slowly, to save him. I used another portion to establish a small scholarship fund in his name at the nursing school where we met for paramedic students who need financial help finishing their training, something I think he would have loved far more than any of the alternatives. I kept the rest because I am allowed to, because it is mine, because no amount of guilt my parents try to manufacture will convince me that the money meant to help me survive the wreckage of losing him should instead go towards smoothing over debts they incurred while choosing, quite literally, a honeymoon over his life. People ask me sometimes, gently, whether I think I'll ever reconcile with my parents. I don't know how to answer that honestly. I think about my mother's hands twisting in her lap at that kitchen table, and I think about Daniel's hand growing lighter in mine in a hospital bed that smelled like antiseptic and wilting flowers. And I think about the specific, deliberate arithmetic that put a honeymoon on one side of a scale and my husband's chance at survival on the other. I think about the fact that when the bill for that choice came due, it wasn't my parents who paid it. It was Daniel. It was me. It is still me, every single morning, in the particular silence of a house built for two people that now holds only one. I don't know if I'll ever forgive them. I know that forgiveness, if it comes, will have to come on my terms and my timeline, not theirs, not delivered on request the way they seem to believe love and money both should be, available on demand, retrievable the moment they need it, regardless of what was withheld the last time it truly mattered. I know that Daniel, in his endless, undeserved grace, would probably tell me to let it go, to protect my own heart from the corrosive weight of carrying this anger. I loved him for that grace every day we were together. But I am not him, and I am no longer willing to hand people my heart on the same terms that once cost me his life. What I know for certain is this. Love that only shows up when it's convenient was never really love at all. It was a performance, staged for exactly as long as it cost nothing. My parents taught me that lesson in the cruelest way imaginable, and I have spent the months since learning a harder, quieter lesson in return. That some doors, once you understand fully what walked through them, are allowed to stay closed.